Alrighty then. I think we're recording. Yep, I checked right after I pushed the button to make sure. Hello and welcome to episode 116 of Question and Answer. Hail audience. I am your host, pannobhasa. And you may notice from the little sticker here, I did my patriotic duty today and voted early. And I don't know, it just was like my patriotic duty to participate in such a historic election between, on the one hand, a totally incompetent diversity hire who cannot answer a single question and who made it into politics on her back, or a Hitler figure who loves Jews, who's going to abolish the Constitution, overthrow our democracy, and set himself up as dictator for life. So, the decision was a pretty easy one to make for me. I'm going to have a drink from my beverage here. Remove the paper umbrella, which does not remove the class of having paper umbrellas. And I got to admit, I'm usually pretty much of a chill person. You know, I'm not an overly excitable person, but I've been kind of stressed out this weekend. I've been stressed out lately, the past few days, and it may be evident in my tone or some such in this Q&A, because as my old boss used to say, I have thrown my sucker in the dirt, and I might actually get myself fired when I go back to work on Monday. Possibly the only reason I wouldn't get fired on Monday is they know that if they get rid of me, they're just screwed and may have to just lock the place up. So, it is an American tradition, like disobedience to superiors, and I'm just like defying an incompetent management at present. But we needn't go into details, because that's not why we're here. We are here so I can answer questions. And I should say this at the beginning. Usually I don't even think of saying this till I get to the end. But if you have any questions about something you think I can answer, particularly about Theravada Buddhism, early Buddhism in general, philosophy even more in general, Eastern or Western, I know quite a bit about non-Buddhist philosophy also, monasticism, Burma, me personally. Got questions about anything like that you think I could possibly answer, feel free to include them in the comments below. And so I'm just going to start answering questions then. And one of the very first questions is from Athena's Sigil. And let's see, I'm just going to scroll all the way down to the bottom. I've got it down at the bottom here. Athena's Sigil asked the question essentially, oh, it won't scroll up here. That's dandy. Okay. His question is essentially, explain the Pali Canon. So I think that's just going to have to be a separate video, just because it's not a question you can answer very quickly. You know, it's not like a one sentence answer when you explain the Pali Canon. So I'll probably do another video, possibly right after this one, and then put them up whenever. So, setting aside Athena Sigil's question of explain the Pali Canon, I'm going to answer the question from GameFap. And GameFap says, do you ever get bored of Buddhism? After all these years, how do you refrain from getting bored? Well, do scientific realists get bored of scientific realism? Do secular humanists get bored of secular humanism? It's just like a model that you use to help you interpret reality. So, reading Buddhist books, I can get bored of reading Buddhist books. Watching Buddhist videos on the internet, I can get bored with that. In fact, I've pretty much always been bored with that. I've just have never been really fascinated by other people's interpretations of Dhamma unless it's under some unusual circumstance. Because most of it I've already heard before 100 times at least. You know, if it's something kind of innovative, I might be interested in that. But for the most part, I remind myself of this jazz musician I used to know. He was a trumpet player from St. Louis who said, he told me he doesn't like to listen to other people's music because he doesn't want it to contaminate his own unique personal style. And I can kind of relate to that. You know, it's like I kind of trust my own judgment more than I trust the judgment of most people who write books about Buddhism or do videos about Buddhism or whatever. But I have studied Buddhism. I almost said bosom. I've studied Buddhism extensively. I studied some Buddhism also. And so, I mean, it's just under my belt. It's like an education. And so it's not like something that one can be easily bored with. I mean, some people assume that all the time, even when I'm not in front of a camera, I'm talking about all this Buddhist philosophical stuff, which I am not. It comes up sometimes. Sometimes it doesn't come up. Usually it doesn't come up. So it's just sort of like this foundation. And I don't see how I would get bored of Buddhism any more than a scientist would get bored of science. I just don't see it. So the answer to this yes or no question that has already taken about 5 minutes to answer is no. I do not get bored of Buddhism, except with regard to reading Buddhist articles or watching Buddhist videos. I usually just don't do that. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Arain. And Arain says, I see a lot of Buddhists in Discord speaking about going to retreats and how nice they can be to set aside the real world, chaos, etc. I once heard it said that a person's garden is their own idea of heaven, and I believe it. How can we use Buddhist principles to make our homes, yards, and living spaces more retreat-like in order to foster a personal space that is more conducive to practice while fostering more retreat-like benefits at home? We see some of this in Zen and with Feng Shui, but is there anything in Theravada that would lead to this? Well, like I used to advise people back when I was a monk, and people would ask me, how can I live a more dharmic, spiritual life? My advice numero uno is get rid of your TV set. And I mean, if you want to set up your house like a Theravadan retreat center, not the way real Theravadan retreat centers are, but the way they would be if the founders, the people who set up those retreat centers, were following Dhamma. I mean, you would not have beautiful landscaping. You might have decomposing corpses, or at least skeletons. You can decorate the house with skeletons. Some of the texts say you should avoid anything beautiful. So, I mean, you just strip the house down to the bare necessities. It would be austere. I mean, if you want your house to be set up like a retreat center, you would want it austere. And, no beautiful decorations. It would just be stark simplicity. So, I mean, maybe if you want to have some semblance of a forest, you could just have lots of plants everywhere, so it's kind of jungly. I mean, you could do that, I suppose. Austere with plants. But, I mean, from a Theravadan point of view, like an ancient Indian ascetic point of view, all the beautiful decorations and everything, you just wouldn't have that. I used to think about this a lot when I was a monk. It's like you read like Buddhist magazines and it's advertising retreat centers. I remember reading an advertisement for a retreat center talking about just the beautiful scenery, and you can go like what is it, water skiing, or it was waterboarding or something. No, waterboarding is a torture, isn't it? No, they didn't have that. But I mean, it's like you can go get a massage like from a Reiki master. You can go swimming at the beach and all this kind of stuff. Just so beautiful. But I mean, if you follow the ancient Pali texts, I mean, you should have like human remains. It's just, it should be like a reflection on asubha, or impurity, or just sort of the disgustingness of life in general. So, for like a person with aesthetic tastes who really likes everything to look nice and everything, you might be better off with Zen. And I mean, with regard to our front yard, we've got this little postage stamp of a front yard now. And I keep saying, I mean, we should just turn the whole thing into a Zen rock garden. I mean, what's the point of mowing this little yard that is useless for anything, really? So maybe if you want your house to be like a retreat center, you may be better off going with Zen and just have like the Japanese elegant simplicity, not a lot of decorations and not a lot of bright colors and everything, maybe some plants. But you want like a retreat center in the spirit of the ancient Pali texts. I mean, it's just going to be just like bare walls, bare floor, as little comfort as possible. And yeah, I don't think that's going to go very well. So I hope I answered that question, because I'm moving on to the next one. And we really do not have an extremely long list, which is convenient for me because then I can devote more time to answering the one whopper of a question from Athena's sigil later on. So this next question is from Pseudonym, which, as I have said before, I doubt that it's his real name. Anyway, Pseudonym says, I just got to milk as much out of that joke as possible. Pseudonym says, how might you guide someone to set boundaries within relationships while also practicing the Brahma Viharas? In other words, how do you prevent the practice of the Brahma Viharas from turning you into a proverbial doormat? And I do not know how practicing the Brahma Viharas would turn somebody into a doormat. You know, it's not going to remove your spine. It might require quite a lot of backbone to practice the Brahma Viharas. So, see, how do you guide someone to set boundaries within relationships? Well, I mean, the boundaries within relationships, it should just be like your ethical principles. You shouldn't have to compromise your principles in order to get along with somebody else, which may be kind of Asperger-ish. You know, it may cause you to lose friends. I mean, sometimes being too honest or too candid can cause you to, I mean, you can lose more than just friends, as I may find out on Monday. But, I mean, just having like metta, karuna, mudita, and upekkha. I mean, upekkha, if you're having a relationship with a woman and you have too much equanimity, that may not go very well. So you may have to emphasize the first three a little more if you're engaged in like a romantic relationship with somebody. If you just are supremely indifferent, that's not going to really be a very, very good thing, I think, from the perspective of the other person anyway. So let's see. How do I guide someone to set boundaries within relationships? Well, I mean, the boundaries is just your ethical principles. It's what you consider to be really important in order for you to have, what's the word? Sometimes words just escape me. Not rectitude, which is kind of an obscure kind of a word anyway. Man, it's weird that I just cannot think of the word. Anyways, just to have like a moral backbone, and then just base your boundaries on that, and try not to compromise what you consider to be really vital to living a good life, a virtuous life, a proper life. You know, don't compromise that any more than you absolutely have to. And that's enough of a boundary, I think. Unless, if you're like a private person, you like a lot of alone time, you may have to set a boundary like, I just need to chill by myself for a while. I don't want to socialize tonight. I just want to relax, maybe kill zombies on my phone for half an hour before I really start engaging, because I just want to unwind. something like that. So, I mean, you have to take into consideration that if you compromise your own principles too much, then you're going to be less of a person that's going to, how do I put this? I mean, you might get along with people even worse just because you're being fake and it's causing a strain on you, which may eventually cause something to tear. So just be true to yourself, I guess. And then I just tried to just pounce back at that word that I couldn't remember. And gosh, I think maybe it has 3 syllables though. So I'm kind of closing in on it. Anyways, so yeah, I really don't see how practicing the Brahma Viharas would turn anyone into a doormat unless maybe they are just already predisposed towards being a doormat anyway. But I mean, if you're not a doormat before you practice the Brahma Viharas, I don't think they're going to turn you into one. If you're kind of doormatish to begin with, then it may be that it might somehow make you even more of one. I mean, I don't even know how. I don't know how the 4 Brahma Viharas of like loving kindness, that's the usual translation. It's not a very good one in my opinion, but that's what it's usually called. Metta or loving kindness, karuna or compassion, mudita or sympathetic joy, and upekkha or equanimity. I don't see how those 4 qualities, even if cultivated, intensively, I don't see how they would turn somebody into a doormat. So I guess that's my answer. And I'm going to move on to the next one. And I'm still like this back part of my brain is trying to come up with the word of, man. I mean, there were times when I was a monk sitting in a cave and it would be somebody's name, some famous person's name, for example, and it would just escape me. It's not just in my old age. It's not like I'm, losing it very much. But I mean, it was like one of them was Herschel Walker. I remember I was sitting in a cave in Burma, just racking my brain, just going through the alphabet over and over again, trying to wait for one of the letters to just kind of click and then just kind of lead me into the name. And it took hours. It just derailed my meditation because I was just so stubbornly determined to remember that name. But I can't really do that here. I mean, probably within a few minutes I'd have it, but you guys don't want to see me sitting here just like furiously cogitating, going through the alphabet, trying to remember a word. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana. And Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana is asking these erudite kind of questions lately. And so his first question is, what are the 4 foundations of mindfulness? Or the 4 applications of mindfulness might actually be a more correct rendering of satipatthana. It would be sati and upatthana, which would be like, the application of mindfulness rather than foundation of mindfulness. But setting that aside, it's satipatthana regardless of how you render it into English. What are the 4 foundations of mindfulness? I mean, why is it a thing? What's the purpose, etc.? Because to me, it seems like an arbitrary classification of random meditations thrown together. Is there supposed to be some deeper original meaning to the 4 foundations, and maybe the meaning was misunderstood later on when they tagged these lists of meditations to them? Yeah, that's possible. And I should have brushed up because I really have never been interested in all these lists in Theravada Buddhism. The 3 of those, the 4 of the other, the 37 of that, just these lists. There was this monk that was ordained at the same ceremony as me. I think he might still be in robes, so he's a senior monk now. But I remember he was just really into Abhidhamma commentary, studying the Visuddhimagga, and he would just have lists that he would be memorizing as a way of studying Dhamma. And it just seems so artificial and arbitrary to me. But you've got mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of thoughts, or mindfulness of mind. Let's see, mindfulness of feelings, and then mindfulness of Dhamma. And that mindfulness of Dhamma, I mean, the first three are pretty straightforward. You know, it's like Chittanupassana. That was what I would tell, like Burmese people would ask me what kind of meditation I would do. Sometimes I would tell them it would be like Chittanupassana or Vedananupassana, which are mindfulness of the mind itself or mindfulness of feelings. And I could be just like getting this wrong because it's been a while since I've studied this. But the first is the body, mindfulness of the body, and like mindfulness of breathing and so forth, mindfulness of just everyday activities, you know, when you're like being aware of the movements of your body and everything. But you're not really being mindful of your body when you do that. It's more Chittanupassana, mindfulness of your mind, mindfulness of mental states, because you're only aware of your body through the intermediate of mental states. So, I mean, the only reason you can be aware of like breathing is through these mental sensations of experiencing breathing. So, I mean, look at my hand. I can contemplate my hand. That's kind of contemplation of the body. I mean, it's not really an orthodox, you know, there is no hand meditation technically, but still, I mean, I'd be meditating on the visual sensation, which is mental, visual perception, which is mental, about a certain amount of tactile sensation, which is also mental. Maybe I could like make sounds, one hand clapping, and then that would be auditory perceptions, which is also mental. So already, I mean, I've been the sort of person that the four satipatthanas really, you know, I would just like, to my critical mind, it did not seem like a very elegant system. It's just sort of, in a way, like Siovach is implying, it seems to me that it's just kind of like this jerry-rigged conglomeration of different meditation techniques just put under categories. Because some of them are very different from what an ordinary person would consider to be, or an ordinary Buddhist or an ordinary Buddhist monk would consider to be mindfulness. Like contemplating decomposing corpses, for example. I mean, that's a kind of mindfulness meditation, but it's really not what we consider to be mindfulness meditation, in the sense that mindfulness meditation is just experiencing whatever is arising just as it is right now without any kind of like verbal commentary. Just as close to unprocessed sensory data as possible, which would also include just thoughts or mental processes as they arise also. So, I mean, if I'm doing like mindfulness on breathing, I'd be more inclined to call that Vedananupassana, mindfulness of just the sensation of touch. Or because the sensation of touch is technically mental, it could also be Chittanupassana. So, I mean, how you look at mindfulness of breathing, it could be any of the first three satipatthanas. And the fourth satipatthana is the one that used to stump me the most. I used to like really like try to figure out what the Dhammanupassana is. And it is somewhat controversial. Different Dhamma teachers will interpret it in different ways. I think Ajahn Thanissaro's interpretation is a fairly good one, but it does seem to be just kind of a catch-all of like dharmic concepts. I think that may have originally been it, where you're just like contemplating dharmic teachings or just Buddhist dogma. Although some people will interpret that differently because it's got lists of qualities. It could be like, you know, it's based on the quality itself rather than just contemplating the list. So I do tend to agree with what Siovach and Sipadzina is implying, that the different meditation techniques arose first and they just got attributed to these four different categories. And like I already said, mindfulness of breathing could belong to any of the first three categories, technically speaking, depending on how you interpret it, how you look at it. I mean, Chittanupassana, maybe not so much, but it certainly could be considered Vedananupassana, especially if you are contemplating the Vedana or the feeling of the air at your nostrils, or if you're more of a Mahasi person doing the Mahasi method, the feeling of your abdomen rising and falling. So it may be that the Buddha originally did teach 4 satipatthanas, and it may be that that has been to some degree lost, or at least very much garbled. But like G.C. Pandey says in his monumental work, Studies in the Origins of Buddhism, even the Satipatthana Sutta, in a way, it's kind of like the Sermon on the Mount to Christians, where in all likelihood, the historical Jesus, assuming that he existed, I don't want to offend anyone on BitChute by suggesting that Jesus of Nazareth really existed, but just for the sake of argument, let's just say Jesus of Nazareth really did exist as a historical figure. Probably the Sermon on the Mount wasn't just some sermon that he delivered all at one time. In a way, it was sort of like collected sayings of Jesus, then wound up getting put into the Bible as one sermon, at least in one of the Gospels, whereas in like a different gospel, I think in Matthew it's the Sermon on the Mount, but in Luke it's like diffused out in probably closer to as it actually happened. And it could be that the Satipatthana Sutta and the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, there are 2 of them, that it was just sort of like a meditation manual, just a list or like a compilation of different meditation techniques that were just conveniently categorized under 4 different categories. So G.C. Pandey is of that opinion. He has some relatively learned reasons for believing that. It does make sense to me. So whether the Buddha originally gave a teaching of 4 satipatthanas, or whether it was just a convenient compilation method of different meditation techniques that the Buddha probably did teach at least a lot of them, then, I mean, it may be impossible to really know the answer to that question. So I'm just going to move on to Siovaksha and Sipad Zidana's next question, which is, where do you think the future of humanity is going based on this video where human brains become fully simulated and we are able to predict and know even individual behaviors better than ever? And he uploaded this, it's like a short YouTube video of some kind of geeky science guy kind of going on and on about how scientists have digitized the brain of a fruit fly, and then they put it into a computer. They uploaded, all the neuronal connections and everything of this fruit fly brain, and then they were able to make a kind of program out of that so that they could kind of input digital stimuli to this brain, and then it would act like a fruit fly. It's like they'd put digital data representing food near the fruit fly, and then the fruit fly brain, I'm having trouble talking with regard to tongue twister kind of words, the fruit fly brain, say that 3 times fast, would like respond with, extruding proboscis towards the food and so forth. And at the end of this little video, the geeky science guy is saying we could do that to a human brain, and that means that with regard to, an afterlife and free will and everything, and then it just kind of like short circuits, and that's the end, because of course he's a kind of materialistic atheist probably, who, he's just sort of like hinting at it without just blurting it out. But I do think it is possible that, say, a human brain could be digitized, but whether the digitized human mind, you upload your personality into a computer, you upload like the brain structure, your brain structure into a computer somehow, that whether assuming that there is some kind of consciousness that is generated through this pattern, this complex pattern, you've got energy there, which then becomes, it's so convoluted and complex that it becomes like self-referential, that, it could like cause self-consciousness to arise. But whether it would even closely resemble the original human with the organic gray blob of meat called a brain, whether they would even be close to each other is questionable. Because science simplifies things And just because they're human, they're going to be oblivious to an infinite number of things that we don't have the sense organs to detect it, for example. And so just because you've got the neuronal sequences or whatever of a brain programmed into a computer, that doesn't mean that you're going to have like this digital brother, this identical twin who thinks just like you inside this computer. That's going to have to be tried, I guess, by scientists who consider the scientific inquiry to be more important than ethical issues, that sort of thing. Because, I mean, brain scientists especially do the most gruesome experiments. I mean, I used to have this friend who was a neurophysiologist, and he was sending me books on like the human brain and all this because I was interested. I want to know how the brain works. And it just goes over and over about just these experiments done on monkeys. You know, they'll take a monkey, they'll cut off the top of his skull and plant like electrodes into his brain, and then make him like solve puzzles in order to get like a squirt of fruit juice into his mouth through a tube because, you know, he's clamped into this cage where he can't move other than his hands, kind of a thing. Or one experiment, some famous elegant experiment where they remove the entire cortex from a cat's brain and then see what the cat does after it recovers from the operation, more or less. I mean, I just felt like dirty after reading the book. It's like I wanted to take a shower after reading a few chapters of this book. So anyways, getting back to Siovac and Sipad Zirna, where do you think the future of humanity is going based on this video? We're going to have to see whether or not uploading a personality into a computer really does replicate a human mind. And that's anybody's guess, really. I do think that probably it's not going to be an exact replica, even if they get all the neuronal structure correct. Then probably they're going to be overlooking something, and it's not going to be equivalent. So it's a question as to whether, you know, we're going to reach a science fiction scenario where people are just uploading their brain structure, their personality. And I mean, your personality isn't entirely limited to your brain structure. I mean, there's all kinds of like hormonal stuff going on, you know, and they're going to have to work that in also somehow. Otherwise, you're just going to be without hormones, not even virtual digital hormones. And still in the back of my mind, I'm trying to remember that word. Oh boy. And I think it's got a G in it, but it's not the beginning. There's a G somewhere in the middle. So let's see here. Where do you think the future of humanity is going based on this video, or human brains? Well, I mean, this is just transhumanism, you know, and we've already started on the road of transhumanism. I think the first person to get false teeth or a prosthetic leg, a peg leg or something, that was like the beginning of transhumanism, where you're combining, you know, like objects with a human being, kind of a thing. But of course, uploading a human mind into a computer. There was a really good movie. I think Johnny Depp was in it, about how this computer scientist, I think, gets his personality programmed into this brain or into this computer. But the thing is, once his mind was programmed into the computer, he had access to the entire internet, essentially. And so, I mean, he stopped being very human pretty quickly. So, I mean, you'd have to upload the human mind into the computer somehow without overlooking stuff like hormones. And then you'd have to, like, upload them into this virtual reality that resembles our empirical reality closely enough that the person wouldn't just go insane. I think in that movie with Johnny Depp, they started off with a monkey. They programmed a monkey brain into the computer first, and all they were getting from the monkey brain was screaming, because it was just so freaked out that it's just like in this black void, you know, there's no trees or even cages, you know, it's just completely beyond its understanding. So, yeah, that's technological singularity stuff, and it's called a singularity because we cannot predict what's going to happen once it hits. So, the future of humanity may not even get that far because once AI becomes intelligent enough, most of you have probably seen enough science fiction movies, like the Terminator movies or whatever, to know that once a computer becomes sentient, if that's even possible, once a computer becomes sentient, I mean, it's just going to surpass us in a matter of milliseconds, probably, because it can program itself. You know, it's like recursive self-programming that it's just going to, it's going to be like the what do you call it? The curve, you know, what do you call that? It's not an S-shaped curve, is it? No, it just goes whoop. And then it'll be as above, far above us as we are above amoebas with regard to intelligence. So, I mean, you just can't predict what's going to happen. So human beings playing with this kind of stuff, thinking that they're going to create heaven on earth or whatever, there's no telling what's going to happen with that. And so I'm just going to move on to Siovakshan Sipad Zidana's third question here, which is, in Anguttara Nikaya 4-37, the Buddha says that one who possesses four qualities is incapable of decline and is in the vicinity of Nibbana. What for? Here a bhikkhu is accomplished in virtuous behavior, guards the doors of the sense faculties, observes moderation in eating, and is intent on wakefulness. And then Siovakshan continues here. Similarly, in Majjhima Nikaya number 53, it says, quote, Mahanama, a noble disciple, is accomplished in ethics, guards the sense doors, eats in moderation, and is dedicated to wakefulness. They have 7 good qualities, and they get the 4 absorptions, blissful meditations in the present life that belong to the higher mind, when they want, without trouble or difficulty, unquote. So then Siovakshan continues here. These 4 are often repeated in many suttas, either as a group or as the 4 practices in the gradual path, such as Majjhima Nikaya 107, which G.C. Pandey thinks is one of the earliest descriptions of the Buddhist path. What is the significance of each of these 4 individually, and how can these be practiced properly? Okay, these 4 individually. So the first would be virtuous behavior, which is keeping 5 precepts, or if you're a monk, keeping vinaya. That would be virtuous activity. And virtue is passive. It's negative in Buddhism. It's not doing things. You can just sit there doing nothing and be perfectly virtuous from a Buddhist point of view. Something like generosity it's different. That's dana, not sila. So the positive things that you do, that's different from virtuous behavior going from a ancient Indian Buddhist philosophical point of view. So keeping 5 precepts for a layperson would be virtuous behavior. Guarding the doors of the sense faculties is a little more subtle. There's different levels to it. I mean, first of all, you guard the door of the sense faculties by just not exposing yourself to a carnival. You know, it's like you go to like a secluded place with not much going on. You go to the Theravadan retreat center atmosphere with bare walls. And I mean, you just try to strip things down as sensorially austere as you can. And then, I mean, even if you can't do that, I mean, that would be like, for starters, that would be like surface level. And then at the deeper level, you just try to stay mindful with clear comprehension so that you don't have a running commentary. You just experience what you're experiencing in the present moment with as little like interpretation as possible. That would be guarding the sense doors. First of all, you avoid excess stimulation. And then secondly, what stimulation you do unavoidably receive, you just do not respond to it. It's sort of like J. Krishnamurti talking about choiceless awareness, where it just kind of goes through you. It goes like some sound, a barking dog, for example, just goes in one ear and out the other ear, and you don't interpret it as barking dog. It's just auditory sensation that you are experiencing while it's happening. And then when it stops happening, you just move on to whatever happens next. You're just in the present moment, just experiencing whatever stimuli are occurring to you, and not having this, I like this, I don't like that. What was that sound? Just this running commentary, this interpretation, perceptual interpretation. You try to stay as close to bare sensory data as you can manage. And even you get like a second chance, whereas even if you start to think, you can still be mindful of the thought and kind of objectify that and detach from that, so you don't still you have a second chance at not just getting lost in this stream of consciousness, this internal monologue. So that would be guarding the sense doors, at least from my interpretation. Observing moderation in eating. For a monk, that's 1 meal a day, and you don't eat until you're stuffed. You eat just enough so that you stay skinny but healthy. With regard to lay people, I mean, it would just be not eating to excess and eating to live rather than living to eat. Not being a foodie, not taking pictures of your food and putting them on Instagram or Facebook or whatever. It's just, you just eat plain food. You're not like saucing it all up with all these flavor profiles and caring about presentation and stuff that you can learn about if you watch a show called Chopped. But I mean, essentially, moderation in eating is just eating what's put in front of you, not being picky in your food, and just eating for the purpose of remaining healthy enough to continue practicing Dhamma. And then being intent on wakefulness, I think the standard dogmatic interpretation of that is that you sleep as little as possible. The ideal in the text is 1 watch of the night, which is 1/3 of a night. So that would be approximately 4 hours. Just sleep 4 hours a night. And there was only 1 month in my life when I was able to average over the course of a month less than 4 hours per night. That usually I'm a sleepyhead. I had to be in some of my best meditation had to be going on in order for me not to need more than 4 hours of sleep. But at that time I had this rule, is that if I woke up and I'd already been asleep for 4 hours, that was it. I had to get up. I couldn't go back to sleep again. And in the text, it says, when you lie down to sleep, you should be like looking forward to getting back up again in the morning. It's like you sleep as little as possible. And for most people, it's going to be more than 4 hours, because, I tried it at a meditation retreat at Pandita Rama in Burma. And I was down to like 5 hours per night, I think. And I was starting to hallucinate in the evening meditations. I was starting to dream while sitting there in meditation. It was like I had this physiological need to start dreaming. And so it would be like hallucinations going on in my head. So finally I had to like increase it to like 5.5 hours. And then it was like the dreaming stage, the sort of the waking dreams didn't start until the last meditation of the evening before I went to sleep. And then it was more manageable. So you're going to have to figure out what the minimum of sleep you can get away with is. At first, when I first became a monk, I'm thinking like 4 hours is like the goal I should be going for. And I was just dragging myself around like a zombie, because before I was a monk, it was like 9 hours was ideal for me. I've always been kind of a sleepyhead, although I don't sleep that much anymore. So those are like the four virtues, the 4 qualities that supposedly, if you possess these qualities, you are incapable of decline. Although, if you lose the qualities, that would be decline. It would seem that once you have all 4 qualities, you'd be like a sotapanna or something, and you couldn't backslide. You couldn't possibly start eating too much again, which I'm kind of skeptical of. That, so long as you have that, you're incapable of decline. But then if you lose any of that, that would be decline in and of itself. So that it would seem to be that once you get these 4 qualities, you just, that's it. That they're not going to go away. no matter what you do, really. So, yeah, it may have started off with the Buddha giving a discourse in ancient India, the Ganges Valley, praising monks, especially monks who keep their precepts, who are restrained with regard to the sense doors, who observe moderation in eating, and who are intent on wakefulness. That would be a monk who is practicing well, and that you can expect progress from that. And then it could be that some of the elaborations on that idea came later to say that, it's like once you get those four qualities, you can't possibly backslide and stop having the four qualities. That would seem to imply that just having those four qualities for just one moment all at the same time would imply that you're an Arya. And I don't think the texts actually go that far. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Dhamma River. And Dhamma River says, I once lived in a Buddhist temple where many monks were quite miserable. They were extremely unhappy. I never imagined monks could suffer so much. It honestly felt like prisoners doing time. It didn't feel like holy men striving for any kind of liberation. Is this normal? Are monks supposed to be like this? Are they supposed to live tortured existences with no joy whatsoever, or are they supposed to live the holy life joyfully and happily? Is a miserable or joyful monk a sign that he's practicing incorrectly or correctly? What are your thoughts? Well, I was a monk for 30 years, and I've spent time at lots of monasteries, and I never, to my knowledge, ever set foot in a monastery where it was just abounding with miserable monks. I don't know what nationality. Dhamma River doesn't say what kind of Buddhists they were. He says Buddhist temple. And he doesn't say what the nationality of the monks would be. So, it could be some kind of Asian monastery where the monks were just, I don't know what country this monastery was in. Maybe they were Asian missionary monks in the West who were they missed being, they were like in this foreign land where they couldn't communicate well, couldn't do the things they used to be able to do back in the motherland or whatever. But even then, generally Burmese monks, and the one Thai monastery I stayed in in the West for a short time, they just did not seem miserable at all. As a general rule, you practice Dhamma, you're going to have a certain amount of serenity, contentment. If you're practicing correctly, you're going to have some serenity and contentment and a certain amount of happiness, although the best kind of happiness for a Buddhist isn't like positive happiness that has the opposite of negative unhappiness, so that you wind up with this duality, this roller coaster ride of up and down, happy, unhappy, happy, unhappy. It would be more just a kind of serenity. But even serenity, or even like neutrality, sort of a serene neutrality, that's not miserable. It may look miserable to other people. That's one thing, is that some people may go to a monastery where monks are practicing relatively conscientiously. And they may think that these monks are miserable just because they're not grinning and smiling and singing and laughing. They may think, man, this is so austere. Maybe they're eating one meal a day of just rice and goop. It's like, how could they be happy? And they're obviously not being overtly, ebulliently joyful. So they may just kind of project that, if they were in that situation, they'd be miserable. These monks aren't extremely joyous. So, it may be that somebody could go to a monastery and see sort of neutral monks as, that project, their own kind of what they would be like if they were in the same kind of environment onto these monks. But aside from that, I've never been at a monastery where, you had all these miserable monks just kind of drooping and moping around. As a general rule, Burmese monks tend to be fairly happy people for various reasons, I guess. And if you're doing intensive practice, you're going to be enjoying the fruits of Dhamma. You know, it's like you're going to be experiencing a kind of happiness that most people just don't experience. So, let's see. Is this normal? No, I don't think it's normal. I never saw it in all my years as a monk. I never was at a monastery. I've been at lots of monasteries, never was at a monastery where even a significant number of the monks were miserable. I mean, there were times when I was a monk that I was fairly miserable, but it was like struggling and striving, just sort of like wrestling with the devil in the wilderness, wrestling with my own defilements. And sometimes you just kind of get depressed or discouraged or whatever. But still, there's this goal of Dhamma that, you know, it's kind of like a shining light on the horizon anyhow. So, yeah, I mean, are monks supposed to be like this? No. Are they supposed to live tortured existences with no joy whatsoever? You're allowed the joy of meditation, and it may be that if they're shitty meditators, they won't be able to experience that. The Buddha did allow a few pleasures to monks. One was the joy of eating, which of course you're supposed to do in moderation. The joy of sleeping, also you're supposed to do that in moderation. The joy of bathing, taking a nice bath, you have to do that in moderation. And then just the bliss of meditation, which you can wallow in that one. So, I mean, aside from that, I mean, tortured existences, I mean, even self-torture is not the middle path, although the austerity of a conscientious monk, I mean, it may look like torture to an outsider, but I mean, it's just sort of this superficial austerity that really is not torturing the mind, other than maybe causing the monk to practice being okay with discomfort. But being okay with discomfort is not the same as being miserable. So is a miserable or joyful monk a sign that he's practicing incorrectly or correctly? Not really, because, I mean, I've mentioned before in these Q&As that there's like 4 different ways of progressing in Dhamma. You can have fast and happy, fast and unhappy, slow and happy, and slow and unhappy. And it's going to depend on like the personality, the character traits and so forth, the paramis, the kamma of the individual who's practicing. So sometimes, I mean, you can be practicing correctly and be miserable. Like there's the case of, let's see, the Buddha gives a discourse on like 4 different ways of practicing Dhamma. This is a different 4 different ways, where one of them, or maybe it's the same one. Let's see. There's the kind, 4 different paths. And there's the kind that starts unhappy but winds up happy. And that's the monk who has strong desires. You know, he's a lustful person, or just by nature, he's just got these, he's a hothead or whatever. And then he becomes a conscientious monk. And it's like restraining him. He is so repressed by restraining his urges that he's like a basket case. He might be just like beating his breast with tears streaming down his face in frustration. But according to the sutta, I mean, eventually he's not going to become enlightened necessarily, because he's got so many strong urges and so forth, but at least he's going to go to heaven afterwards as a result of that. And I mean, that's kind of like the biblical Christian approach. You know, you're supposed to be miserable now so you can be happy later. So, I mean, that does have a certain application in Buddhism. So, I mean, whether a monk is miserable or joyful really is not a reliable, like a statistically significant correlation with whether he is practicing correctly or incorrectly. I mean, if he's serene and content, then that's a good indication. But if he just laughs a lot and smiles a lot, I mean, it could mean that he's just not very serious, and, you know, he's just kind of a wise guy who has a good time easily amused or something. So, Yeah, I really do not consider like the dichotomy, the duality of misery and just joy or elation, like manic and depressive. I don't think that is really, either one is a good indication of whether a monk is practicing correctly. I mean, he would be following the middle path between misery and like elation, misery and just being giddy with joy. He'd be following the middle path of just serene equanimity. But I mean, we are human, and a monk is repressed. I mean, your animal urges you have to just, I mean, you wind up having to repress your animal urges a lot, which, I mean, if you know about Freud, he would say that's going to make you a neurotic basket case. But I mean, at a higher level, once you get good enough at it, then you just watch these urges arise without reacting to them. That's mindfulness. That's not just repression. That's allowing it up to the surface, not just pushing it down, and then just kind of processing it, transmuting it into something neutral by not reacting. But I've kind of wandered away from actually answering this question. But yeah, it is definitely abnormal to go to a Theravada Buddhist monastery and have a significant number of the monks there be miserable, unless maybe something really horrible is going on at the monastery. And then it would be temporary. And even then, the wiser monks would be more serene than like the rookies. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Cherzaskazes. And Cherzaskazes says, let's say I am in Burma and I tell people that I am not a monk, and everybody knows this. And now I shave bald and wear monk robes and bowl and everything, and I walk from town to town just for the fun of it. Would I be arrested? No, you would not be arrested, because that sort of person in Burma who looks like a monk and dresses like a monk and acts like a monk but is not ordained is called a yadait. And I used to have a friend, he was from Texas. He was a monk for many years, and then he kind of got, I know, it was like he didn't follow the middle path very well. He was like a Buddhist Rambo. Most people will stray off into the self-indulgence side of the middle path. He strayed over onto the excessive ascetic rigor side. And so it was like his lute strings were too tight and he couldn't play music properly according to the metaphor. And so eventually he just kind of burned out and kind of like turned against Buddhism at a surface level, but deep down he still believed it. And so he became a yadait, and which means, I mean, he wore monk's robes still. He shaved his head still, sometimes, not always. Some yadaits don't shave their head. And he just went for alms still. He lived inside of a big hollow tree, big banyan tree for many years. And everyone was cool with that. So, it is a traditional thing in Burma that you can be unordained and still live pretty much of a monastic, like a monk life. And so long as you admit that you're not a monk, that you are a yadait or whatever. And yadait, interestingly, the word yadait in Burmese comes from the Sanskrit word rishi. So it's like you're a rishi. That doesn't come from Pali, because the Pali word is isi. So they got an R in there, that which the Burmese pronounce like Y. Burmese often pronounce R like Y, because in the original Burmese language, there was no R sound. Asians have a thing with the letter R for some reason. East Asians, anyway. So, yeah, you would not be arrested. And if you were a serious practitioner, you meditated, you calm and restrained in public and all that, then you might actually still be respected, and people would be happy to put food into your bowl. I'm not entirely sure about other countries, but in Burma, it's a traditional thing that has been there for hundreds of years. So I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from 5 Precept Paul, formerly known as 5 Precept Pete. And 5 Precept Paul says, I recently had a difficult encounter with someone and found myself stewing in resentment. It made me wonder When I was filled with hate, was I sending harmful energy towards them, possibly causing misfortune in their life, or was I only hurting myself? Well, mainly you were hurting yourself. And it's the other way too. If you're sending metta to other beings, mainly you are benefiting yourself. Whether they will receive that metta or not, or whether they will receive that hate or not, depends on a number of factors, your mental states, their mental states, how sensitive they are to vibes in the air, so to speak. So it may be that they received some harmful energy from your anger at them, but it's mainly their own karma. Like whatever they did, is maybe they did some dick move against you. Then in a way, it's their own karma that's causing their suffering, rather than any kind of hate you're beaming at them. Although, I have experienced metta from, other people. It's like my preceptor, for example. He didn't like me very much. I was just this wild, unruly barbarian. And, I'm still that way. I defy authority sometimes. It's like I follow my conscience before I will follow some authority figure, which, it's like a tradition in America, civil disobedience. America as a nation arose from civil disobedience. So anyways, he didn't like me very much. But then one day I was outside doing something and I just had this rush of it was like someone was just beaming love at me. And then it turns out that at that same time, my preceptor was in the Dharma hall leading a metta meditation. And it could have just been some coincidence, synchronicity or something, but I do think that he was deliberately, oops, I just got the message that my battery's about ready to go dead because I forgot to plug the computer in this time. One moment, please. Let's see here. You can just admire my aquarium while I'm doing this. Ugh. Okay. We're doing all right. I hope that it's I'm not using more battery power than I'm getting, because sometimes in the past, for some reason, like the fan's going on the computer and it drains the battery faster than it recharges. Then I just get down to 2% and it starts freezing up and stuff. So anyways, let's see. We're getting back to, the preceptor. And yeah, so I do think that it is possible. Mental states are contagious. Like if you beam hate at somebody, they're going to feel the results of that. And just saying, well, it's their own karma, that might kind of justify to yourself what you're doing, but still you're making bad karma. It's like punching someone in the nose. It is true. It's their karma to get punched in the nose. Otherwise you couldn't punch them in the nose no matter how hard you tried. They have to have the karma that allows them to get punched in the nose. But still, even though they are repaying a karmic debt, you are making new karma for yourself by punching them in the nose. And so it's really not some kind of, you can't use that in a casuistic manner and say, well, it was their karma. So, I could just take all of their property away from them and it's their problem. It doesn't work that way. Because it might be their own karma to experience what they're experiencing, but you're making new karma by doing it. And so sending harmful energy towards people, it can work, but still you're hurting yourself more than you're hurting the other person. Arguably, even punching them in the nose, you're hurting yourself more than you're hurting the other person, even if it breaks their nose. Because they may have just paid off a karmic debt, but you have just incurred a new karmic debt. So, yeah, the short answer, I'm really not good at short answers. I always have to meander all over the place. But, it may be that if you're beaming hate at this person, they're going to pick up on some of it. It may cause them a certain amount of dukkha, some troubledness of mind or something. But still, you are mainly hurting yourself. And I'm going to move on to the next question here. This is from Romeo. And Romeo says, one of the central themes I find in your Q&As is the importance of one's mental state in generating the right momentum to carry you through this life and towards the next. With this in mind, my question pertains to how to mindfully be aware of current events in the conventional samsaric world when it objectively seems to be going to hell in a handbasket. I say this as an admitted yet conflicted news junkie who feels the need to keep abreast of what's going on in the world, even though doing so often brings me down. Every now and then I try to go on a news fast, but it doesn't usually last for very long. They say ignorance is bliss, but I honestly don't see sticking my head in the sand and tuning out what's going on in the world as an option for me. One of the things I like about your Q&As is that you balance the pursuit of ultimate truths while still being grounded in conventional samsaric everyday reality. You seem to be able to strike the right balance between cultivating and maintaining a pure positive mental state, while at the same time being aware of current events and the negativity often found in them. Any suggestions on how I can strike this balance as well? Well, I mean, first, with regard to ultimate truths in the plural, I really think that ultimate truth is one. There is only one ultimate truth over which a wise man could argue with another wise man, as the Atakawaga puts it. But that's just sort of a quibble. I think in order to be able to see current events with equanimity, there are two things that you can cultivate. I mean, there's probably other things you can cultivate, but two just occur to me. And I'm still trying in the back of my mind to remember that one word that I can't remember now. So even when I stalled for a second to drink from my cup, still the word did not arise into my sensorium. So, two things that you can bear that you could try to keep in mind. One, if current events are bugging you, read history. Read Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, for example. Read about the Huns or the Mongols. Even read about World War I or World War II. And you'll see that it's not just that things are fucked up now. It's the world has always been fucked up. That's what samsara is all about. In fact, things are actually pretty good compared to the way they've usually been in the past. I mean, we're just kind of soft and gentle now. We've been feminized so that now the problems are causing through like degeneracy rather than barbarian invaders raping and pillaging. Or just psychopathic kings or emperors or whatever. I mean, things were really messed up, even in the Buddhist time. Like on the list of 10 dangers that is given in the text occasionally, that danger number 1 on the list is kings. The danger of Raja or kings. And it's not just enemy kings invading like your own country. I mean, your own king can be a danger to you too back in those days. There were no constitutional monarchies in those days. It was, you had a king. He was usually a kind of sociopath, or a lot of the time he would just be this ruthless sociopath. That's maybe how he became king in the first place. And he can just do whatever he wants. I mean, human rights are a modern innovation. Maybe like the Romans and the Greeks, maybe some of the ancient Indians also. You know, could it be an Indo-European thing? This whole idea of human rights, or at least the rights of the citizen. But I mean, mostly, I mean, that's for the most part, that's like a modern innovation. So just, I mean, read Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. You want to see just a shit show that lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years. And another thing is just bear in mind that whatever we are experiencing, it's our karma to experience. So, I mean, if you want things to work out better in the world around you, I mean, you got to work on yourself and make what's inside you better, and then it's going to be reflected outwards. It was like Eckhart Tolle, I think it was in his book, The Power of Now, saying that some people who disapprove of what's going on, you know, in the outside world, it's like somebody standing in front of a mirror, like this, like raging against their own reflection in the mirror. because it really is, the world we live in is a projection of our own mental states, in a sense. So just kind of bearing those two in mind, I mean, the easy route is read some history and just see what a shit show history is. I mean, it's just, for most of the existence of the human race, I mean, things have been a heck of a lot worse than they are now. I mean, we're just kind of in a decadent degeneracy stage. I mean, the shit hasn't really started hitting the fan, and it won't necessarily start hitting the fan. I mean, the Roman Empire, it pulled itself out of, almost destruction more than once. Like the Emperor Aurelian pretty much almost single-handedly, and with the aid of the legions, just prevented the Roman Empire from just fragmenting into these little petty states all over the place. So, yeah, that would be my two bits of advice on that one. Is read more history. Like Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire is classic, and just bear in mind that the world we live in, our karma has landed us here. Our own mental states, our own actions. It's our own doing, which new agey or like woke kind of Western Buddhists will call that victim blaming. But that is just basic Buddhist philosophy. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Skuladin, or Skuladin. He never tells me how to pronounce his name correctly. And there is a non-zero chance that even if I knew how to pronounce his name correctly, I still just might deliberately mispronounce it. So anyways, Skuladin says, are there any benefits to going to hell? And then he likes bullet points, like little commentary after the question. So the bullet point here is, I remember once you mentioned that some retreats were advertising people reaching heaven or hell realms on the first day. Well, it's not exactly going to hell. It's more like using clairvoyance to see hell. It's sort of like Dante in the Inferno. He's just a visitor. He's not stuck in hell. He's not being tortured in hell. He's not receiving the punishments. He's just being guided by Virgil through, being shown, like on a guided tour through hell. And the meditation retreat, there was, the meditation retreat center in Burma that was advertising how if you attend one retreat, you'll be able to go into the heaven realms, go into the hell realms, and see the beings there and all that. It was like mainly using clairvoyance. Probably the body of the meditator was still sitting there on the mat when their mind is observing heaven realms or hell realms or whatever. So it'd be more a matter of just like the divine eye, clairvoyance, allowing you to see heaven realms, see hell realms, rather than actually going there bodily. So Dante even went farther than the meditators at this meditation center. So, I mean, the benefits of actually burning in hell, being tormented in hell, like being reborn as a denizen of hell. Yeah, you could argue that you're burning off some pretty serious karma by going there, but it seems to me that if you're going to go to hell for crimes or sins, what do you want to call it? Defects, moral misbehavior of just committed over a matter of a few decades. And then you're going to burn in hell for a zillion gajillion years for doing that, which is what Buddhism teaches essentially. If you go to hell, like Avicii hell, the bottom pit of hell, you're going to be there for a long, long time. So, in order for you to be there so long for just you just happen to murder somebody or something, which sent you there, or you badmouth some saint or something, then, it seems to me, and the hot weather in Burma caused me to have this idea that once you get there, it's so miserable that you are so miserable that you're just generating like these foul mental states that are perpetuating your stay in hell. It's like you are so miserable, you are just cursing the entire universe, that kind of thing. So yeah, there's no benefit to that. You're better off just being reborn as a human, having just the usual human fuckery happen to you, and just getting through it as well as you can, rather than burning in a Vici hell and being hacked by demons with axes and that kind of thing. So I'm just going to move on to Skaladin's next question. Is there any specific methods to breach the shores of hell, or would I just need my guru's blessing, like Jao, Skuladin, go to hell with love in your heart? So, I mean, if you actually want to go to hell, to cultivate clairvoyance through jhana would be like the acceptable Buddhist way of at least cultivating the capacity to view hell realms, to see them with like clairvoyance, the divine eye, dibachaku. And I still can't remember that word. So, yeah, so it'd be just cultivate jhana, whatever kind of jhana works best for you, whatever kind of meditation technique conducive to jhana you are best at, then you can try, and there's still no guarantee that you're going to get psychic powers by doing it. Personally, that meditation center in Burma that was advertising how people who go do one retreat will be able to see the heaven realms and see the hell realms and all that, it was probably hypnosis, self-hypnosis. Because I don't know. I mean, in Buddhism, to be guaranteeing that your first meditation retreat, you're already going to have psychic powers, it seems way more likely that it's just a kind of hypnotic trance rather than genuine jhana. So, yeah, I think you'd have to be able to, I mean, it's possible if you had like some guru with psychic powers who could just lay his hand on your head. Yeah, lay his hand on your head and then just like kind of beam something into you. Ram Dass says that Neem Karoli Baba would do that kind of stuff to him sometimes. Other people would say the same thing, that he could just like lay his hand on your head or just say something or do something. And I mean, you could have like this flash of, you know, some kind of paranormal activity going on. But I think the standard Orthodox advice on how to breach the shores of hell, as Skaladin says it, would be to cultivate psychic powers through in deep meditative states. So I'm just going to move on to Skaladin's third question here, which is, have you ever performed or been part of an exorcism? And then his bullet point comment here is, I know beaming metta is the orthodox stance, but surely you could just choke slam Lord Zaraxis back to hell. Well, the thing is that demons in Buddhism don't come from hell. I mean, there's demonic entities down there, but the ones up here don't come from there. They're just terrestrial demons, or they're coming from, you know, some valley in the Himalayas that, you know, they're just kind of making forays over the mountains into the Ganges Valley, and then they're going to be going back to the Himalayas after they've wreaked their havoc, so to speak. But have I ever performed or been part of an exorcism aside from just chanting? That is the way in Theravada Buddhism, at least Burmese Theravada Buddhism. You've got someone who is supposedly possessed by a spirit, or you've got a haunted house. The monks go there and they chant parita, which are protective chants. I've done that a lot of times. When I was living alone, there was this guy, he had to have been autistic. He was not like mentally like towards the center of the statistical bell-shaped curve. And he was having trouble with spirits pestering him all the time. And the best advice I could give him is, chant the Metta Sutta, memorize the Metta Sutta and chant that, because that is the standard Orthodox way of like appeasing and sort of diffusing malevolent supernatural beings. Just beam love at them, and then they can't maintain their shitty attitude towards you. They are appeased, they chill out, they feel happier because you're beaming love at them, which helps them to be happy, maybe even against their wishes. And then they'll leave you alone because happy beings don't want to make trouble for other people. It's unhappy beings that try to make trouble for other beings. You got some bully raging on a subway or something. He's not a happy person. You got some radical leftists screaming in your face. They are a very unhappy person, and that's why they're doing it. Criminals that like to hurt people, that kind of thing, they're hurting too, and they just are taking it out on others. They're just lashing out at others. It's not society is to blame, it's their own doing, but still, they are unhappy and they're taking it out on others. So it does make sense as a Buddhist technique to beam metta at malevolent beings, even though some people might think that's kind of unfair. It's not justice that bad people should have love beamed at them. They should be punished somehow. But I have done kind of exorcism. I remember once when I was in college, I had to move out of the college housing for summer break. It wasn't open during summer break. So I moved into this little studio apartment, and it just had like this dark vibe. It's like I couldn't really relax there. I always felt kind of at a sense of unease there. There was like some kind of, who knows what the hell. It was an old building. A lot of people had been living there. Who knows what kind of stuff had happened there. It'd be like certain kind of like seedy motel rooms that have that same kind of vibe. Like, who knows what kind of shit has happened in this room before. So I was just getting interested in Buddhism back then. And so I just did like a little ceremony. I didn't use sage. I hadn't heard about sage yet, fortunately, because burning sage always gives me a headache. But, I lit some incense and I just started chanting. I think it was the Diamond Cutter Sutra, because I hadn't really been fully converted to Theravada yet at that time. And it seemed to have helped. At least it was the placebo effect. At least I was more at ease. A lot of the time in haunted houses, you're in a house that's supposed to be haunted. It's like your own apprehension and fear of what might happen helps stuff to happen. So it could have just been a kind of placebo effect. But I did do like this little purification ceremony in that apartment to kind of, in a way, it was kind of an exorcism or just a way of like cleansing the atmosphere, sort of making the atmosphere so clean that dirt-liking spirits would go away, kind of a thing. The impure spirits feeding on impurity would go away because the place had been purified, so to speak. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question here. And this is from Xenothoid. And Xenothoid has asked 3 very long questions. Lots of question in these 3 questions. So might as well just dive right in here. Xenothoid says, before hearing the 4 Noble Truths, I was severely depressed because my desires in life were not being met. When I heard them for the first time, I understood that they were logically coherent, but I initially did not understand the full weight of their implications. However, a few days later, I had what I would call a mini awakening experience. I vividly remember standing around at work and feeling a sudden rush of understanding over the fact that desire is the cause of all suffering. Desires only exist in the mind. One only suffers when desires are present, and that these desires can be eliminated from the mind, therefore leading to a state of perfect peace, which could be called salvation. From that moment forward, I never again felt the feeling of doom I had about life previously. It felt like my entire worldview changed in an instant, all because of a few simple facts primarily revolving around the second noble truth. Things didn't magically become perfect, but I genuinely feel optimistic about life again because I am fully convinced of the reality of liberation. My consciousness feels bright again, similar to how it did when I was a devout Christian. It's shocking to me that I used to believe that life was simply good or bad entirely based on external circumstances, and that if my desires weren't fulfilled, I might as well die. I consider the fact that you only suffer because you want something rather than not having the thing you want to be the most important fact about life. My question is, does this type of experience have a name in Buddhist philosophy? It feels too big to just be called insight, but definitely not big enough to be called stream entry or anything like that, because it was just a realization of facts within the confines of samsaric language and not an intuitive understanding of anything close to the unconditioned. Well, it would still be considered insight. I mean, you can have liberating insight. You can have little insights, or you can have just the big insight that just causes you to wake up entirely. So yeah, it would definitely be on the spectrum of insight. But I do agree with this personal story here that, I mean, I've said it many times. If you know only one thing about Buddhism, if you know only one thing about Dharma, you should know the second noble truth, which is whenever you are unhappy is because you want something. And it's your own action. You don't have to want it. It's like people think that they don't have any choice but to be unhappy when it's raining on the day they're supposed to go on their picnic. You know, it's just like, that's the way most people are. In fact, most Western Buddhists are this way. I think maybe even most Eastern Buddhists still adopt this kind of like materialistic or realist attitude that being unhappy is imposed on you from outside, when really, ultimately, according to the second noble truth, all unhappiness is self-inflicted. And that is really a super empowering idea. You are no longer a victim, unless it's just a victim to your own bad habits, your own habitual bad mental states, or just of your ignorance of the second noble truth. Some people, I mean, it's even like relatively wise Western philosophers. I think even David Hume had this idea that, you know, certain external things happen. You just have to be unhappy. I mean, you don't have any choice. But I mean, to an enlightened sage, I mean, if you read William James, The Varieties of Religious Experience, he gives a lot of examples of like people being like whipped and beaten. I mean, they were like French Protestants, Huguenots, I think they were called, the Huguenots, and the Catholics were persecuting them, and they were just being like whipped with rods and so forth. But they were so charged up with faith in their religion that they were just swooning with joy at the honor of being whipped and beaten in the name of Christ. A lot of like the Christians who allegedly were fed to lions in the Colosseum, it was the same kind of thing. They'd be singing hymns of joy while, you know, the lions are running amok killing them, because it was such an honor. You know, even in the Bible, I think it was in the Acts of the Apostles of the New Testament, where some of Jesus's apostles, after Jesus is dead, they get summoned to the Sanhedrin. They're warned to stop teaching this Christianity stuff, and then they're whipped. And then as they're leaving, they're rejoicing. And so really, I mean, it's not necessarily insanity that causes somebody to rejoice at being whipped and beaten. It's just a matter of your own attitude. So, I mean, that is really one of the most liberating things. And I've told people many times, if you know only one thing about Dharma, it is that whenever you are unhappy, it's because you desire something. And that desire is optional. Ultimately, that is a volitional act. So your own unhappiness is a volitional act. It's just self-imposed unhappiness. And the second thing, I mean, if you only know two things about Dharma, the second thing, what I've told people, is that regret or remorse is always bad karma. It always just makes things worse. So I think I'm just going to move on to Xenothoid's second long question, which is I could have answered that question with just like one sentence, and I didn't. That's why these videos are so long. Anyway, Xenothoid's second question: How do you know when somebody is ready to hear the Four Noble Truths? Question mark. But then he's got like this additional stuff here, which I may as well read, I guess. He says, from my last question, you understand that I believe the Four Noble Truths, primarily the second, are an earth-shattering realization about the nature of suffering and contentedness. The thing is, I think these truths could initially have a negative effect on the life of someone who is already happy and fulfilled. I remember being at an Eastern Orthodox church about a year ago when a little old Christian woman who was obviously very happy and fulfilled in life said something like, "Come for cookies and fun," when referring to an event the church was hosting soon. It was a very cute moment that felt straight out of a cartoon. I think it's pretty obvious that this happy-go-lucky little old lady is going to be experiencing better mental states when she's spending time with her family and community, receiving the holy sacraments and imagining her eternal life in Christ Almighty's boundless love, rather than contemplating the nature of dukkha, contemplating how her desires are actually the root of any whatever suffering she does experience, being told to meditate on death, etc. I do believe that Buddhism is fundamentally life-denying, multiplicity-denying religion, but that doesn't strike me as a bad thing. However, to many people, Buddhism is seen as gloomy. I saw a comment online from a Buddhist turned Christian that Buddhism is embracing depression. My friend, who only has a cursory knowledge of Buddhism, said that it seems like a form of nihilism. Sometimes I want to explain Buddhism to people when I see them in bouts of depression, but I worry that if they don't fully comprehend the logical conclusion of the Four Noble Truths, which is salvation, it may actually break their psyche even more, because they will see that the things they still do enjoy about life are fundamentally meaningless. Okay, so let's go all the way back up here to the actual question, which is, how do you know when someone is ready to hear the Four Noble Truths? Well, you don't necessarily know. I mean, in a way, the fact that you're telling them the Four Noble Truths means that it's their karma to hear it. But that doesn't mean that they're ready to accept it. I mean, they might hear it and reject it with scorn, with ridicule, which would actually cause them more harm than if they never heard it at all, maybe. With regard to the little Christian lady, I mean, something resembling the second noble truth is found in the general epistle of James. And James was wiser than Paul of Tarsus, in my opinion. And James supposedly was the leader of the Christians after Jesus died, assuming, of course, that Jesus ever existed. Don't want the BitChute people on my butt. So, yeah, I mean, I think that the general epistle of James, I haven't read it in years, but I'm pretty sure it does say something about how it's like suffering is caused by desires. So, I mean, it may be that the little old Orthodox Christian lady was just very wise, or it could be that, you know, she's happy at church, even though there might be other places when she's not where she's not so happy. I mean, most normies, you know, most people that don't really do deep meditation, I mean, they're going to be upset a lot of the time when things don't go their way or whatever. So it's hard to say about this little old lady. I don't know her at all, of course. And so she may have been just really wise, just a serene, contented person, or it may be that she was just, you know, happy when she was at church and maybe just was taking it out on her daughter or something at other times. I don't know. But let's see here. Let's see. Yeah, Buddhism, in a way, it's life denying. Yeah, I mean, you're not supposed to wallow in it anyway. I mean, you can accept it with equanimity. It's not, I mean, pushing it away, that's aversion. You know, you shouldn't have attraction or aversion if you can help it. So to that extent, it's not so much life denying as just sort of like, you know, putting up with it. Multiplicity denying, yeah, at the highest levels, it is multiplicity denying. But I mean, it's gloomy to people who want sensual pleasures and so forth. And they just don't get it that there's a higher level of happiness that comes from intensive Dharma, which does include a certain amount of asceticism. You know, to avoid pain, you also avoid pleasure to some degree. And then you get this serene equanimity that's in between the pleasure and the pain, or the happiness and the unhappiness. So So let's see. Sometimes I want to explain Buddhism to people when I see them in bouts of depression. Yeah, I mean, you don't want to philosophize to people who are miserable. That does not work. I mean, you got someone who's miserable and you're telling them, yeah, it's all self-inflicted. It's not even real anyway. It's all an illusion. I mean, you're likely to get screamed at or something. I mean, some people, if they really are miserable, the best thing you can do is just give them a hug. Don't try to philosophize at them. Maybe, after they're feeling better. That's one thing about Dharma is you need to learn it when you don't need it as bad. Because if you wait until the shit is hitting the fan, so to speak, then, I mean, it's not, how are you going to practice mindfulness only when these really horrible mental states start to arise? You got to practice it like in a relatively calm state so that it's second nature by the time the shitty mental state starts to arise. That you've already got you've got it down somewhat so that just it's like second nature to be mindful of it. And then you neutralize it. You transmute it into something ethically neutral. So I don't know if I've even answered this question. Let's scroll way the hell up to the top here. How do you know when someone is ready to hear the Four Noble Truths? I mean, you really don't know. I mean, if they are in like a contemplative, they're unhappy, but they're like seeking, they're searching for why, or, how do I make this better kind of a thing, then they might be receptive. In fact, they may be more receptive to learning about the second noble truth than when things are going okay and they don't give a shit. They're in Western normie mode of thinking that whether you're happy or unhappy depends on external circumstances. And it looks like, my battery's up to 11% now. So I think we're not going to freeze up and have other glitchy malfunctions necessarily. So, yeah, I mean, it would depend. You're going to have to pick up on them. I mean, if they're just shut down, they're so miserable, they're just closed off and just, I mean, you can get a sense at if philosophizing at them is just going to make things worse. Then you might be better off just giving them a hug and, just be nice to them and just let them kind of deal with it. Give them some kind of superficial advice on how to improve their situation or some such, but leave the philosophy alone for a while. But if they do seem to be like really questioning, maybe even reaching out in despair because their habitual way of dealing with reality isn't working anymore. I mean, if they're having a crisis like that, then it just may be that they are ripe for hearing some kind of profound truth that can turn their life around. Because there is a certain aspect of human nature. There's a book about it called Battle for the Mind by William Sargent. It's a profound book. It's one of the most important books I've ever read that talks about how we are creatures of habit. We just have this habitual way of going through life. And even if it doesn't make us happy, at least it gets us through life well enough that we're just kind of locked into that. And it's only when we have a crisis, when our habitual way of dealing with life just isn't dealing with it anymore, that we become very open to suggestion. That's how like Chinese thought reform works. It's how a lot of things, even certain kinds of like religious retreats work this way, where they just like they put you into a crisis, and then you can be born again, or you have your insights, or you realize that communism is the one true way, or whatever it is. You go through the manhood ritual, that kind of thing. And so I think my answer is even longer than the question here. So I'm just going to move on to Xenothoid's third question, which is, what is the best way to introduce someone to intention-based ethics when they've only ever known vague utilitarianism and consequentialism? And then that's the main question. And then he goes on to say, when I tell someone I'm a Buddhist, they'll often ask if I'm a vegan, and then they will be perplexed when I tell them I'm not. How can you, quote, how can you financially support meat companies when you know they kill animals if your religion demands that you never kill anything? Yeah, I get that sometimes too. They ask, No, they ask, I struggle to explain this because I don't know how to go about properly justifying Buddhist ethics. I can point out problems with consequentialism, like how it inevitably leads to horrible greater good atrocities. But to them, this just sounds like a criticism of the concept of morality as a whole, not utilitarianism, consequentialism in particular. Well, that is kind of a tricky question, the actual question is, what is the best way to introduce someone to intention-based ethics when they've only ever known vague utilitarianism, consequentialism? If they're just locked into like Western scientific realism, then, if they're just locked into Western style samsaric realism, it may be like talking to a wall. You may be just wasting your time and effort trying to help them see the light, so to speak. You might explain that, ethics in Buddhism, what is good karma is what gets you closer to reality, closer to enlightenment. And what is bad karma takes you farther away from enlightenment. And that is purely psychological. It's purely mental. I've given lots of examples, or maybe just the same example over and over again, of how two people can do exactly the same thing outwardly, but one of them is making good karma, the other one's making bad karma. Saving the frog from a snake is the standard example. I've given a few other ones. So, if you can eat meat with pure mental states, Jesus ate meat, assuming that he really existed. Gautama Buddha, according to the earliest text, the Pali text, he ate meat also. The enlightened monks ate meat. Tibetan monks eat meat because, you can't grow many crops in Tibet very easily. It's just, like the Bible says too, it's not what goes into you that defiles you, it's what comes out of you that defiles you. It's your own actions that defile you. So, you could use your own ways. I'm not going to try and formulate an argument here. Just putting forth the point that ethics really is psychological. It's not materialistic. It's not this outward thing. And that whether we are happy or not depends upon our own attitude. That might be the start, is like the whole second noble truth thing. And then once you can kind of get the point across that ultimately all suffering is self-inflicted, then maybe you can kind of go with the idea of karma and mental states. And really, it's your mental states when you're doing something that makes something ethical or unethical, not the mechanical outward action of it. But I think you might have to tailor your arguments to fit the individual, just as the Buddha did. You find out kind of what their point of view is, and then you kind of, angle the argument to be more likely to be something that they can accept. Like if they're a Christian, for example, you can use like the general epistle of James, or, some of the quotes that I've already given. Like it's not what goes into a person that defiles them, it's what comes out of a person that defiles them. That kind of thing. But if they're just like an atheist, if they really are just scientific materialist and think that, there's, let's say that they're indoctrinated into postmodern leftism, where they just have to say that, if victims are victims because of Whitey, for example. It's not, the second noble truth has nothing to do with it. And in fact, I've said before, there actually are Western Buddhists, I'll put in scare quotes here, who say that the second noble truth should be modified, because not all suffering is caused by desire. Some suffering is caused by patriarchal oppression. And with someone like that, you're better off just keeping a safe distance from them, if at all possible. Do not engage them in any kind of conversation that may result in them becoming red-faced with hysteria or just like sneering at you. So anyways, I'm just going to move on to the next question here. We've been going for less than 2 hours. That's something. And Rui is our next questioner. Hail Rui. And Rui says, how much value would you place on rebirth by aspiration? Like someone who wants to be a bodhisattva, I guess. I had a teacher in Burma who was he wanted to be a kind of bodhisattva, but maybe he was just too humble to aspire to becoming the next, like a future Buddha. He wanted to be a future great disciple, because according to like tradition, each Buddha has 2 chief disciples. Our historical Gautama Buddha had Sariputta and Moggallana. So each Buddha, for unknown reasons, I don't think the text ever really explain why this has to be so, but every Buddha has to have 2 chief disciples, and his aspiration was to be reborn in some future age as a Buddha's chief disciple. Or, I mean, there's other ways of rebirth by aspiration, like some old temples, like in Burma, for example, will have these little inscriptions. It's like a clay tablet that has this inscription on it, and people will like donate it or like offer it at an altar at this temple. And a lot of these little clay tablets are women that are praying to the Buddha or whatever power there is at this temple, that in their next life they can be reborn as a man. That was actually fairly common, because men were considered to be superior, at least socially and physically. So how much value would I place on it? Well, I mean, it can be done. I mean, even according to Orthodox Theravada Buddhism, or it's sort of like in the Upanishads, whatever a man inclines his mind toward, that does he become. So, I mean, if you have this deep like drive or urge or desire to be reborn in some certain way, you want to be a rock star or something, then, I mean, your karma is going to be kind of moving in that direction. And so, I mean, that does happen. If you're just not ripe for enlightenment yet, you're being realistic, let's say, and you just don't even really want to become enlightened yet, then, I mean, you can kind of steer your course through karmic samsara in certain ways. And I mean, it's a samsaric thing. You might, there might be some dharma to it, like Pure Land Buddhists, for example. They want to be reborn in this kind of Buddhist paradise where it's easier to become enlightened. And the Buddha didn't teach it. I'm pretty sure the Buddha said, if at all possible, strive to become enlightened in this very life. You don't know what your next life's going to be. There's no guarantees. Strive to become enlightened in this very life if you can, or do your best. That's the best you can do. And so rebirth by aspiration, I mean, the Buddha says you should not hope for any rebirth. I mean, that's even back in the Atthakavagga. That's like primordial, archaic Buddhism is saying, do not wish for any future existence. But, I mean, it can still work. It's not really orthodox Buddhism, except for maybe some kinds of orthodox Mahayana Buddhism, or I guess it even kind of worked its way into Theravada with devotionalism, where some people can, aspire to be a Buddha, or like one of my teachers, he aspires to be a future great disciple or some such. But even that is a kind of deviation away from the earliest primordial teachings of a sage does not desire any future existence. You should not aspire to any future existence. Or you shouldn't even aspire to non-existence. You shouldn't be aspiring for any future state at all. So, I mean, there is some validity to it in a samsaric context, but I'm fairly certain the historical Gautama Buddha did not endorse it, and he would discourage it. And so, I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam. And Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam, says, did you ever consider being a Dhammayut monk? And the easy answer to that is nope. I never considered becoming a Dhammayut monk. I mean, you can kind of think about it. I mean, you might have to consider it just enough to reject the idea. So maybe there was sort of like casual semi-consideration, but I was never seriously tempted to become a Dhammayut monk. And those of you who don't know what Dhammayut is, it's the strict sect of Theravada in Thailand. So I wasn't even in a Thai tradition. And the Dhammayuts, they're somewhat puritanical in the sense that they don't consider any other monks to be real monks. Only Dhammayut monks are real monks, plus maybe the Mon tradition that Dhammayut was derived from. So, I mean, Burmese Buddhism was also derived from a Mon tradition, but I never was able to determine whether Dhammayut monks in Thailand would consider Burmese monks to be real monks. But the Mahanikaya monks, which is the most populous sect of Theravada in Thailand, they don't consider them to be real monks. They will not do ceremonies with them, for example. They just consider them to be lay people wearing robes. And it seems to me that the onus would be on the Dhammayut monks to prove that. I mean, there is some wisdom to innocent until proven guilty. So to some degree, it's like their kind of haughty intolerance in a certain way. At least it can come off that way. It's like something that I wasn't really interested in. Also, in order to be reordained as a Dhammayut monk, you'd have to like reset your seniority to 0 by becoming a Dhammayut monk. If you had been a monk for 3 years and then you switch over to Dhammayut, you got to do, I think it's called Datli Kama, or it's like the act of making firm. It's like you have to be reordained, and only this ordination is the real ordination because you weren't really ordained before then, that kind of thing. And it just never really appealed to me. And I'm not so much of a stickler on like unbroken lineage to think that you have to have an unbroken lineage of ordinations from the Buddhist time until now in order to become enlightened, for example. I mean, that's sila bata paramasa, or adherence to morality and observances. And it wouldn't even be morality in that case. It would just be observance of the ordination tradition or some such. So I could have just said no, but I have to give the long answer that's much longer than the question itself. And so I'm just going to move on to Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Libralam's second question, which is, what do you think of the parable of Jesus leaving behind the 99 sheep for the lost one in the context of mudita, as we understand it in Buddhism? Compare and contrast, please. Well, I mean, my understanding, I haven't read the New Testament very recently. I'm like struggling, there's like this back part of my brain trying to remember that one word. Then there's just this blockage. So anyways, my understanding of the parable of, you got a shepherd who's got 100 sheep, and one of the sheep gets lost. It strays away from the flock. And so the shepherd will temporarily abandon the 99 in search of that lost sheep. And then when he finds the lost sheep and brings it back, he's rejoicing more over that one sheep than he rejoiced over the other 99. And mudita, I don't see how it even fits into this parable, because mudita is rejoicing in the happiness of someone else. You are glad that someone else is happy. And I mean, would the shepherd be rejoicing that the lost sheep that has been found is happy? I mean, it might not be all that happy. It might be like struggling in his arms as he's carrying it back. It might be preferred. Maybe it went away just because it wanted to go away. And now he's dragging it back to those 99 assholes that one sheep had just been barely tolerating all this time. So I don't think mudita necessarily fits into the context of this parable at all. I mean, who's experiencing the mudita? It's not clear to me. It's like, I mean, you've got 101 beings in this parable. You got the shepherd, you've got 99 sheep that don't get lost, and then you got the sheep that does get lost. And who's experiencing the mudita? I mean, the shepherd might be rejoicing that he got his one sheep back, but that's not mudita, because mudita is being glad that somebody else is happy. So I don't think it really fits the context, or maybe I'm just not understanding the parable, but I'm not sure who even in the parable would be experiencing mudita. So, I mean, the parable, my understanding of the parable is that, God rejoices in reclaiming a lost soul more than he rejoices in the 99 souls that weren't lost and didn't have to be like saved. But I mean, I'm not sure where the mudita fits in. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Philalethes. And Philalethes says, what is the Buddhist teaching on close friendships? Are they just a form of clinging? Some close friendships could be a form of clinging, but not all close friendships are a form of clinging. I mean, it may be you've got like the wise friend, it's like you got the preceptor who loves you like a son and you love him like a father. And there might be a certain amount of clinging, but it's not just clinging. It's not even mainly clinging. It's just, there's like this symbiosis going on with both sides benefiting in a sense. So, I mean, I still have a few friends from high school, at least one in particular. I had a second friend from high school who died recently. But I mean, we were friends. I mean, we weren't super close anymore because they were living on the West Coast and I'm now living on the East Coast after having lived in Asia for many years. So, I mean, it wasn't really a close friendship, so maybe it doesn't apply here. But, yeah, I mean, a close friendship, or like a romantic relationship, it's not just a form of clinging. Different people are going to have different levels based on their own personality, their wisdom and all that. But, I mean, there's definitely more to it than just clinging. So, I mean, some friendships are definitely encouraged in Buddhism, especially the friendship with the Kalyanamitta, the good friend, the spiritual friend who helps to guide you in Dhamma. And I mean, it can be sort of like the disciple-guru kind of relationship, or just even like a father-son kind of relationship, which, I mean, father-son relationships aren't just a form of clinging, although there generally is some clinging in there. So the Buddhist teaching on close friendships is the main kind of close friendship would be the Kalyanamitta of the spiritually oriented friend who helps you to practice Dhamma. That would be the main Buddhist teaching in the Pali text with regard to close friendships. So I'm going to move on to the next question here. Do you think friendships can last a lifetime and stay genuine? Sure. I mean, most of them don't. But, I mean, most of them don't last a lifetime. But some people, I mean, especially if you live like in a third world village where, I mean, you grew up your whole life with your next door neighbor. You played together when you were kids, and you grow up and you're still friends, and neither one of you moves out of that village. As your parents and grandparents, and just going back generations, all lived in that same plot of land in that village. It's way easier in like a pre-modern kind of society where people don't move around much. And people are also kind of more close-knit, less alienated. So it comes easier in a place like, rural Burma, for example. But it's possible in the West too. Like I said, I've had friends that since I was a teenager, most of my friends since before I was a teenager, that we've just drifted away, partly because, I just drift away. I moved away from my hometown long ago. So the people that were still living in my hometown, or, some of them drifted away from the hometown also. So, I mean, it's less likely to happen in the modern West, where people are more mobile and not just rooted to the land in this, ancestral village. So I'm just going to move on to Philalethes' next question, which is, many people seem to desperately desire these types of friendships, close long-term friendships with members of the same sex, and yet struggle to achieve anything that's not shallow, which usually just ends up hurting them even more. Is it even worth it? Well, I mean, if they can't achieve anything that's not shallow, it may be that they themselves are shallow. And a shallow person is not going to have a deep relationship. A shallow person has to have a shallow relationship. Let's see. I mean, it seems to me that that kind of friendship should arise spontaneously. I mean, it's like if you have to make effort to have this long-term friendship, then, I mean, it's kind of forced. It's not spontaneous and natural. It's like this artificial thing that it's more likely to fail. So, I mean, I guess the healthiest attitude is just to be open to the possibility of it. Although, you know, once you've become several years old, it's hard to have a lifelong friendship with anybody because there's already been those several years before you even met. So, yeah, struggling to achieve, I mean, that's like struggling to have a stable relationship with your mate, you know, like a romantic relationship. When it becomes a struggle, I mean, if there's struggle occasionally, like in times of crisis, you know, somebody's having a meltdown and the other one is kind of, you know, one or both of them are kind of struggling to deal with this crisis situation or whatever. I mean, that's going to happen. And even really good friends may get pissed off at each other sometimes. But to just have it be like this chronic struggle just to cultivate this long-term friendship, yeah, I think you're starting off on the wrong foot with the whole struggle thing. You're better off just accepting the friendships that you have, whether they're friendships for a day. You know, you're sitting next to somebody on an airplane, strike up a conversation, everything's fine. You have a nice conversation. You might even exchange phone numbers or something that you'll just promptly forget and you'll never call the other person. But I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, pretending that you want their phone number if you really don't, I mean, that would be a certain kind of dishonesty, but still, I mean, making a friend with somebody for 5 minutes while you're standing in line to vote, something like that, there's no problem. Or having a friend that, I mean, you went to kindergarten with. I mean, that's fine too. I mean, there's nothing necessarily wrong with having a friendship that doesn't last forever, because really nothing lasts forever anyway. So, I mean, it's like making a problem that doesn't necessarily have to exist. Just accept the friendships that you've got, value the friendships that you've got, especially if it's a good friendship. And that's good. And I still can't remember that word. So I'm just moving on to the next question, which is from Joe Doe. And Joe Doe says, do you believe that the idea of the bodhisattva has no credibility at all? I am a big fan of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Do you think the concept of his return to help humanity lacks wisdom and that there is no validity to his rebirths? Well, this is kind of similar to a question I've already answered about aspirational rebirth. But this is kind of a different angle on it. Do you believe that the idea of the bodhisattva has no credibility at all? Well, I mean, I think it can happen. And it may be that the Dalai Lama really is like the same being reborn over and over again. You know, they do all these tests. You know, they'll have this array of objects that the child has to pick the right one consistently, and which is like, that's what the previous Dalai Lama, that was like his property, that kind of a thing. You know, they got these filters, these tests, which is going to be overthrown, if at all possible, by the Chinese Communist Party after our current HH, the Dalai Lama, passes away, because of course they're going to want control over the next one. And so they're just going to say, this is the one, and they're going to like groom him to be like the authentic Dalai Lama, even if he isn't. So, I mean, it can happen. Like Neem Karoli Baba up on the altar back there, according to him, he just keeps getting reborn, and it's mainly as a kind of bodhisattva, even though he's a Hindu. So, I mean, it can happen. But like I said before, it's not really in accordance with what the Buddha was teaching, unless they're so advanced that they don't even have aspiration anymore, that it's just the karma of the beings in the world that are like almost summoning this being to be reborn among them, who really there's nobody there if he's fully enlightened. He's just sort of reflecting their own karma back at them with nobody there. But that wouldn't so much be a bodhisattva as just a fully enlightened being, or some being just this far away, an auburn pubic hair away from full enlightenment, which maybe I shouldn't make jokes about that. But yeah, I wouldn't say that has no credibility at all. It is a samsaric phenomenon, so it's not ultimately real. But within a samsaric context, like an empirical Buddhist philosophical context, that, I mean, it can happen. Presumably it does happen. And I don't have any dog in the fight with regard to whether the Dalai Lama has been the same being reincarnated over and over again. That I guess tradition says that the Dalai Lama is actually an avatar of the Buddhist god Manjushri. You know, he's a kind of bodhisattva god, the god of wisdom, and a bodhisattva at the same time, very advanced one. And I'm a little more skeptical of that idea, but it is possible that you can have like a tulku. I think a tulku is just like a being that deliberately is reborn, and then there's like this lineage of this same being being reborn as this tulku. I think. I'm no authority on Tibetan Buddhism. So, I mean, ultimately, from the point of view of ultimate reality, there's no validity in anything samsaric. But within the context of samsara, I do think it is conceivable. I mean, I'm no authority on this, but it is conceivable that you can have an advanced being who is deliberately kind of choosing his next life and just having like a lineage of physical lives with the same conscious entity inhabiting them as a kind of tradition. I mean, it's conceivable. I don't see why it would be necessarily just flat out impossible, but I can't really say it. It's not really in the Theravadan tradition anyway. So I'm just going to move on to Jodo's next question, which is, if you have watched the Joe Rogan podcast with Trump by the time you answer this, what was your thoughts of so? Or if so, maybe he meant to say. And I did see part of it. My sweetheart was watching it, but I was kind of busy doing other things through a lot of it, including taking a shower, and I went out to vote. See, I went out to vote. Where is it? Right. Did it fall off? No, there it is. See, patriotic duty. Everyone should go out and vote. It's early voting now, but you can, in South Carolina, early voting started like last Monday. So, yeah, I did watch the Joe Rogan podcast. I mean, it wasn't any kind of heavy hitting political manifesto or anything. It was just Joe Rogan and Donald Trump just hanging out like friends and having this conversation that went all over the place. They're talking about, you know, whales, the effect of windmills on whale sonar, and talking about like UFC fighting and boxing, and talking about politics. And it was interesting. And Kamala Harris would be utterly incapable of doing that. And she's not going to go on Joe Rogan. She's been invited, I think. But I mean, she cannot communicate without reading a teleprompter. She can't answer the simplest questions. She'll just go around a word salad, apparently as a kind of strategy not to pin herself down to any position that intolerant leftists of some strand of leftism would hate. So, I mean, she's just like, she gets asked a question about, you know, her position on something. She'll just meander around and around, cackle a little bit, not answer the question. And then if there's a follow-up question, like, well, I mean, the question was this, and she'll just like get uncomfortable and nervous and won't answer the question. And on Joe Rogan, I mean, she'd be subjected to that for 3 hours. And I just can't imagine her actually doing that. So, I mean, Donald Trump is actually like a human being. He's not just projecting an image that he is like, what you see is what you get with Donald Trump. But Kamala Harris, she's just trying to project this phony image to distance herself from her own past behavior, her own past record, and the past record of the administration of which she is a part. So she's just doing this dance, and mainly it all boils down to Donald Trump is bad. You need to vote for me because. So, I mean, that really doesn't answer the question, though, does it? What are my thoughts of the Joe Rogan Trump discussion? I don't know if you could even call it an interview. It's just these two guys hanging out. I don't know if Joe Rogan would actually get baked before he would do an interview with Trump. It's my understanding that he usually smokes out and is high when he's doing these podcasts, but maybe out of respect for Donald Trump, he refrained from getting loaded before the show or during the show. No, I mean, it wasn't any kind of really hard hitting. Some of the stuff that Trump would say was the same kind of stuff he would say in his rallies. It was kind of interesting towards the beginning where he's talking about just how surreal it was becoming president. Being shot through the ear, he said wasn't surreal. I mean, he was just like in this state of heightened awareness. He knew where everything, it was like crystal clarity when he got shot through the ear. But when he was like walking through the White House, like the private quarters and everything for the first time, it was like a dream state for him. It was hard to really kind of realize that this was actually what he was doing. So that was kind of interesting. It was just like a little bit of personal details about the life of Donald Trump, who does strike me as a much more genuine person than his main competitor in this presidential race that's going on. So might as well just move on to this question. And it is the last question, the very last question. So this is a relatively short Q&A, although there's going to be like an appendix to this Q&A in which I'm answering Athena Sigil's question for me to explain the Pali Canon. So anyways, this is the last question. This is from Bukyoto Pranav. And Bukyoto Pranav says, the age of saints and sages are over and there won't be any new religion on the face of the earth for some time. Do you agree with this? And not necessarily. I mean, I wouldn't make that assertion. I would not just flat out say the age of saints and sages are over and there won't be any new religion on the face of the earth for some time. It may be that, I mean, for some time, I mean, that could be like a day or a century. I mean, for some time is kind of a vague statement. How long does for some time last? But anytime in the foreseeable future, maybe. So, I mean, I don't think that the age of sages are over. The age of saints is kind of over because Western culture is pretty much taken over the world, and Western culture is not particularly virtuous, even though people think that they're virtuous. They just have kind of a distorted understanding of what virtue really is. For example, the postmodern left considers any kind of sensual indulgence to be completely divorced from virtue or morality. But sages, I still think, like you could say Eckhart Tolle is a kind of sage. There are a lot of sagey type people, even though they might not be saints. Like J. Krishnamurti was a kind of sage, and even though he wasn't a saint, and he kind of started his own kind of religion, really. I mean, there are a lot of followers of Krishnamurti even today. Like the person who was ordained at the same ordination ceremony as me. He started off being a follower of Krishnamurti. And another guy that I know, he was born in Ojai, California. His parents were like at the Krishnamurti ashram. He was pretty much born into the Krishnamurti ashram. But, and I mean, Krishnamurti wasn't exactly a Hindu. I mean, it was just sort of his own thing. So there are like these new little religions that kind of arise, not mainly because of saints, which is, it may be that because they're sages but not saints, there's just not, and there's maybe a little too much scandal for the tastes of like skeptical, cynical Westerners or some such. But there's no tell. I mean, it may take Western civilization, or at least some area within the sphere of Western civilization, to have some kind of like shit hitting the fan crisis kind of a situation, for people are in sufficient despair that they're willing to let go of their former conditioning and accept some new system with some charismatic teacher who may be a saint or a sage teaching this. And then, you know, the old way isn't working anymore. This is generally how new religions arise, or at least a lot of the time. That's pretty much how Buddhism arose, and Christianity, where just the old ways are just becoming obsolete. And so people are in this state of like ferment and largely just despair. And then this new optimistic, idealistic system arises, generally with some charismatic teacher, and then it just somehow strikes a chord. It just seems to fit the zeitgeist or whatever, and people join it. And it's hard to predict whether anything like that is going to happen anytime soon. It might, but I mean, it's not really conceivable that, I mean, you can't really predict how or when or where it's going to happen. So, I mean, there is a possibility. So I'm not going to just deny that the age of saints and sages is over. I'm not just going to assert that, and that there won't be any new religion on the face of the earth for the foreseeable future. I don't think that's necessarily the case. Anything is possible. And so it may be that, you know, things are going to get bad enough somewhere in the world that people are going to reject their old conditioning and reach out to some new system that just happens to be arising in the area with some charismatic leader. Who knows? So that's it. I answered all the questions again. And so, like I said at the beginning, if you have any questions that you think maybe I can answer about religion, Buddhism especially, early like Theravada or like archaic Buddhism especially, monastic discipline, Burma, me personally, philosophy in general, whatever, if you think maybe I can answer the question, then feel free to ask in the comments below. If you have access to Subscribestar, you can ask them there. If you have access to my Discord server, you can ask them there. And like and subscribe if you have not done so already. And be happy.